What's really surprising, exotic for us French, is that it's the other side of the world, and what we find at the other side of the world is directly relevant to us.
Trusted from the grave. There's nothing left to salvage, no one left to blame. Among the broken mirrors.
Je vais prendre l'exemple juste d'une brochure, toute belle, une brochure qui est produite par ce qui n'est pas l'équivalent du ministère.
Here's an example of a simple brochure produced by ERO, the Educational Review Office, which isn't the equivalent of the Ministry of Education but works alongside it. On the first page, we have a blank space. This is quite surprising because in France we like to fill the spaces with lots of text. It's simple and there's a message which is written in both Māori and English. So it already tells us something about the approach to education, which includes the whole culture. The message in English is the child, the heart of the matter. We're talking about a student-centered system. Learning has taken over, dissolved the old organisation. Since the Education Act of 1989, the whole system has been reorganized and modernized.
L'ancienne organisation, donc depuis 1989, finalement l'acte d'éducation en Nouvelle-Zélande, c'est un système qui s'est complètement réorganisé, qui s'est modernisé. Enfin, la Nouvelle-Zélande est une terre à la fois d'émigration, mais il y avait donc aussi des immigrés à l'intérieur, paradoxalement, qui étaient donc ces autochtones qu'on avait finalement spoliés de leur culture et de leur terre. Et le fait d'avoir pris conscience et d'avoir reconnu finalement l'état des choses, des lieux, l'état...
New Zealand is a country of immigrants, but there's also an indigenous people. They'd been deprived of their culture and their land, and the fact that the state of affairs was realised and recognised made it possible to rethink the bigger picture, what needed to be done to raise student achievement. To discover this, they asked the students themselves. They did a series of interviews with students and parents, but also with teachers and principals. The analysis of these interviews, Culture Speaks, explains to the letter what was said. From the transcripts they extrapolated elements, beyond reform, elements of deep systemic change. 3 areas were identified. Of course, they're the areas of what needs to be done in society. These are areas which education has no control over, like politics and the economy. These are matters outside school. Within the school, there are the organisational aspects like timetabling and the use of space, which are determined by the school leaders and management. Then there's the third area, which concerns the act of learning itself and the relationships within the classroom. This is an area which is very innovative for us, as there's been very little study done in France on what constitutes effective learning.
Qui était le domaine propre de l'acte d'apprendre et de la relation dans la classe. Et donc c'est vraiment ce domaine très finalement innovant pour nous parce qu'on a très peu en France par exemple étudié ce qu'étaient les facteurs d'efficacité de l'apprentissage. C'est donc tout un domaine, hein. C'est le domaine donc de l'organisation de la classe, de la nature de la relation entre le professeur...
So it's a whole area, the area of classroom organisation, of the nature of the relationship between the teacher and the students. And this gives rise to a process which is no longer called training. The concept of training has morphed into something more. They call it a process of professional development, which encourages teachers to investigate their own practice through inquiry of self and others. So that means a process of confrontation and co-formation which is highly evident in all institutions. So as you can imagine, there's a real deprivatisation of practice, which is mind-boggling in France, where the staff room has been likened to an egg box, whereas in New Zealand there's teamwork that's organised and even supported by the job description.
D'équipe qui se fait, qui est organisée, qui est même commanditée par le référentiel métier.
Māori believe in looking after visitors, so it's just been a natural thing to do.
When a teacher deals with the student, it's how he speaks to him, how he regards him. It's something we don't talk about here. It's neutral. It's not part of our analysis. Students have indicated repeatedly in the Culture Speaks analysis that what matters most is the way they are regarded, talked to, and the way their work is received and meaningfully commented on. It's also the way of fostering the students' progress, giving feedback and feed forward. What are you going to do with it? So giving the choice and responsibility back to the student to accompany him. The term to accompany is interesting. It's not necessarily expressed that way. This term accompany means being the best supporter of your students, of all your students. There's also the way the group is organised and how cooperation is organised to ensure that students are interacting in class, cooperating, working on real projects, not just regurgitating information or doing exercises. It's working on taking responsibility, not just for yourself, but a real exchange of knowledge. This is what's interesting. The fact that they work a lot on reflection about the learning process. That's where you see mind maps appearing and lots of little supports, things displayed on walls.
C'est cette nature-là qui va être intéressante. Le fait de travailler aussi beaucoup sur la réflexivité, de travailler sur ce qu'on va appeler en France des bilans de savoir, et donc c'est là où on voit apparaître les cartes mentales, on voit apparaître plein de petits supports et des choses qui sont affichées au mur. C'est très étonnant de voir cela, là où en France on est encore dans une théorie de l'enseignement.
It's very surprising to see that whereas in France we're still very much into theory of teaching, not lecturing but teaching, in New Zealand they've switched completely to learning. It's not all roses, they're long-term changes, but they're very supported. So teachers aren't left on their own to do it. It's not by writing about revolution that you make it happen. It has to be supported. People undertake an inquiry into partnership with others rather than of others. It means that the evaluation of teachers has been revolutionised. There are no longer any inspectors. The subject inspector has disappeared, to be replaced by a system of global evaluation of the institution on the one hand, and on the other, inquiry into practice, professional development, learning from each other, team building around your own knowledge.
D'enquête sur les pratiques, d'enquête, encore une fois, de développement professionnel, de co-formation, qui est très étonnante, ce qu'on pourrait appeler du team building, c'est-à-dire la construction d'équipe autour de ses propres savoirs. Et effectivement, quand on va à l'autre bout du monde, on vient toujours avec ses propres lunettes. Et donc, nous qui sommes mobilisés à présent sur l'histoire du socle commun, enfin, on va le dire.
Of course, when you go to the other side of the world, you always go with your own glasses. We are currently very engaged in the story of the common core, the socle commun, knowing at the same time that it's not really French but European. I was impressed by what was done in class and by the documents that were displayed. They've been working for several years under what they call the new curriculum. That's what it's called, so it's not the Common Core, but it talks about basic skills, key competencies of students. They don't have 7 like we do in France, but 5. They are similar to ours, but we've felt the need to add humanist culture, for example, something that they've integrated differently. They're very centred on the process of learning and cooperative learning. So the key competencies are really social competencies. This is how they're defined in the curriculum at a national level. It's not a neoliberal country like the UK, it's a country which has decided to reform itself with a government, a Ministry of Education that decides the framework. They've defined the framework of the objectives and the key competencies of the students, but that means that institutions are free to decide how to implement it, and that's what's mind-boggling for the French.
Avec un gouvernement, un ministère de l'Éducation qui définit le cadre. Et donc, ils ont défini le cadre au niveau des objectifs et des compétences clés des élèves, mais ça veut dire qu'ils laissent la liberté aux établissements, là ça va être hallucinant pour la France, de dire comment on le fait. En France,
in France, we were very attached, and still are, to content, knowledge, programs, which are all national, except that when we analyse this in the field, we notice that what we call the student's curriculum is in fact very different. So, in France we say things, but we don't do them. In New Zealand they don't necessarily say things, but they do them. They design integration of key competencies when programming a task, a complex project, not a project for students to reproduce a task, a real challenge with problem solving. They also do task-based learning. How are we going to do this? It's a question for the group. So they bring into play different types of knowledge, methods, tools. They're undertaking research. It's interesting because the working on this task is going to be displayed on the board. On the board there are reusable signs indicating the key competencies. These are used to label parts of the task, identifying which key competencies are being developed at each stage. For example, when you do this action, you are developing these 3 key competencies. Each time there's this reflective feedback. This is what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Ce qu'on est en train de faire, comment on le fait. Finalement, pour avoir des bons résultats, il ne faut pas s'y prendre à la fin, il faut s'y prendre au tout début. C'est ce qu'on apprend dans les bonnes écoles, mais c'est ce qu'on ne fait jamais.
After all, to get good results, you don't start at the end. You have to start at the beginning. That's what we learn in the good schools, but we never do it. Focusing on the learning means that it's a process which is going to be activated from the beginning. And for example, something which is going to work for the students is also going to work for the teachers. And there's an extremely simple tool which has been developed, and for which I haven't yet seen the application in France. It's the portfolio tool, and in particular an online tool called My Portfolio, which you can easily find on the internet. It's accessible, you can test it. It's a tool for students to gather knowledge, processes and achievements. This same tool, My Portfolio, can also be useful to pre-service or in-service teachers. It can also be useful to principals for managing both pre- and in-service staff. So evaluation isn't a matter of checking on compliance, but progressive inquiries by each teacher into his own practice and also for purposes of communication. What does teacher training consist of? Well, when you're a teacher you've already done a university degree, but by and large you've done very little pre-service training, and you go through a process of analysed and supported practicums. So you have a mentor with a template incorporating a set of competencies, just like the Common Core for the students, the equivalent of the Common Core. And you have a sort of fairly simple checklist. There aren't 50 sets, there are 5 sets. So the beginner teacher starts to document, to say, this is what I do and this is how we do it, both through discussion and keeping of records. There could be little videos, photos, links which he's working on. So it's professional knowledge building, very interactive, not only with your advisor but also with a community of teachers. It's this support, this evolution that we must undertake now, with a window open on other systems. New Zealand is on the other side of the world. It's exotic enough not to be threatening for us. And we should also look in the direction of Finland, which we've already done with the Kiva program, which has been selected at European level, and with other systems. Once again, the questions which we're being asked here in France aren't specific to France, specifically French. They are first and foremost of a professional nature, and we should take an interest in them in this capacity.
Et avec d'autres systèmes, encore une fois, les questions qui nous sont posées ici à nous en France ne sont pas spécifiquement françaises, elles sont d'abord de nature professionnelle et nous devons nous y intéresser à ce titre.